But let me show you real quick what I've done. I'm not going to go over Tiny Dungeon 2nd Edition. If you want to know more about how Tiny Dungeon 2nd Edition works as a role-playing system in a virtual tabletop, then watch my Fantasy Grounds, porting Tiny Dungeon 2nd Editions to Fantasy Grounds, and it'll give more. This will just be showing what I did, how I set it up here in Foundry. It's also not a Foundry tutorial. It's not a Foundry showing off Foundry either. There's plenty of videos for that, but this is what my port of Tiny Dungeons for those interested. This is also a module. This area here, it's fairly plain without this module, and this allows you to quick roll dice. You can set up if you need to, but I just think it looks better. But this is as Fantasy Grounds would have, this is your chat area, and this is the module, the Dice So Nice, which is, I wasn't even going to get Foundry if it didn't have 3D rolling dice. Oh, and the other nice thing about Foundry that really sold me on it is it's a one-time $50 purchase, and only the GM or one player has to own the license, and then anyone else can connect with a link. So unlike Fantasy Grounds, where everybody had to either own or have a subscription to connect, unless the game master owned the $100 and something ultimate license. This one's just a $50 straight up one-time purchase, and then any players can connect to his session. You can run multiple games as long as you're not running more than one session at a time. Each session would require, if you were going to have multiple GMs play with your license, each one would have to have a license, but not a concern for me. Now, if you were into D&D or some of the other systems that have purchasable content, you could buy them through the module sections, and they would cost you separately. But I'm not doing D&D, and that's why I ported the Tiny Dungeon system in. Now back to it. It has a combat tracker. It acts different than Fantasy Grounds. You tell a token to go to the combat tracker, or if you set it up through quick encounters, when you activate the encounter, it will automatically put them in combat tracker. But your players, you can assign who's in the combat tracker, but otherwise it functions the same. You can advance through it. You can hide people that you don't want the players to see on their screen. You also, as you see the hit bar here, you can add hit bars to your tokens in Foundry, which these are fodder. They only have one hit point. So if you see a token with no hit point, that means he's fodder. Your scene screen, where you can manage and keep track of your scenes. These are all the actors, and these are all my pogs you would have seen in my prior videos that I've made through internet images. Well, it's just something else I added really because of the functionality of Foundry, which I didn't have in Fantasy Grounds, is I was able to make a baggage NPC type, which is where your mules, if you had a cart, if your party had hired a porter to carry their goods, he has his own NPC type with the items area where you can put stuff on him and then show whose stuff that is. Got the neutral pogs, this stuff here, the sheet templates and all this is all part of Sandbox, where you can set up these different templates. And this is the workaround for the parcels, the campaign loot parcels. I made an example loot template using Sandbox, and the other nice thing about Foundry is all these fancy icons, and it's super easy to make new icons from pictures from the internet. And a program like Gimp or Paint.net, which I use Paint.net, and it have fancy icons in all your equipment, which you'll see also in a minute. But in this one, I can make a parcel. I can set this up prior to the adventure if I know what the loot's going to be. If I roll the loot first, the final treasure room or such, or treasure rooms in the adventure. And I could set this up, and then when the players see the items in these lists, they can say what they want, and then I can set this up, and then we can update their sheet at the end of the adventure or whenever they're ready. I can also take this information between, if you didn't set it up at the end, I could sit in my between game times. I can take this information and create a special item that they can bring, and I'll show you that in the items menu in a minute, that they can then auto-populate their sheet with these items. So it's just an extra step. It's not a one-click like it was the parcels in Fantasy Ground, where everybody selected on the sheet and then you hit go and it split everything up. It's not that simple, but that's an example of something I made with Sandbox. And now in the items menu, we have everything that I've ported from my Tiny Dungeons set up. We've got all the armors, and they all have icons, and they have their descriptions, any attributes that I want to be able to manipulate, like costs and weight. We've got the drinks. Now this is the equipment. Now this is a deployable adventures kit. So let's create a actor real quick. He's going to be a new player. So this is your player character. And you can assign him an icon. This is the default. You set the template up to be the PC template. And this is the template that I created in Sandbox for my Tiny Dungeons. It contains everything and more that my Fantasy Grounds, the core RPG character sheet had. And the tabs are across the top now instead of down the sides. This is the GM view. In the player view, you wouldn't see this. See items. This is a maintenance thing for the GM. It just shows all the items that are listed in the character sheet, no matter what they are. Now on this sheet, the weapons would be here, and the items would be in this list here. And I separate them because weapons activate differently. They have these are quick dice. Advantaged, normal, disadvantaged quick dice. Let me drop a weapon in here, I'll show you. And once again, everything has icons. Even the little ice hook has icons. Everything has icons. So let's throw us a Morning Star in here. And so you see you have uses, which are your break factor, your durability. At the end of each combat or time that say you're using it to break down a door, the GM could require you to roll a break factor test, a durability test. You roll a 1d6, and if you roll a 1, you lose a use, in which case you would activate it. Now it had 4. Then that's how you'd use. This is used typically different. For like a potion, it would have uses. You'd use this, and it would consume it, and then it would if it wasn't a refillable object, it would disappear from the character sheet. If it was refillable, it would just go to 0, and then this would turn into a recycle sign that once you refilled it, you clicked it, and it would go back to full. But these have their advantaged roll, normal roll, and disadvantaged roll. And when you click it, it auto rolls. And you'll notice it's set up to where successes automatically flash when they come on. And in the you can click the details over here and see what the actual rolls were to see there were 3 successes rolled. 1 was a crit, but 3. And weapons do crits in my home version. You can click whether you've mastered it or not, which would be the only way you could roll advantage, whether it does crits or not, and then of course the cost. Now items would deploy the same way. Now I've got one called the Adventures Pack and then Adventures Kit deployable. Every new character gets an Adventures Kit, and it's deployable. So when you hit deploy, and this is how you would set up your loot. I can duplicate this or create a new one and call it Jazz's loot. Everything that she's gathered from that adventure can be put into it, and it can be drugged to her sheet, and then all you have to do is hit activate, and it automatically deletes the container, and autofills the inventory with what was in that deployable kit. So it's a usable workaround that works pretty good, in some ways better. Now, the Adventurers pack is you would also drag in, because it by itself contains your faded cloak, bedroll, tent, tarp, pots and pans, and wood and eating utensils. That way those things don't take up your inventory. If you have this, you just always have these things. And I guess if you lost one of those things, you just have to notate it. But these are things that very rarely, typically if you're going to lose something, it's because you're going to leave your pack behind because you left a situation in a panic, or you had to swim a river and couldn't carry it, or it got stolen, in which case you'd have to completely replace this stuff anyway. So this just keeps 5 or 6 things from populating unnecessarily populating just by having this one item. Your oil flask, each use drains the oil flask, and when it gets to 0, it'll have the recycle, because it can be refilled. So once you've refilled it, it's back to 6. Water skin, same way. Flint and steel, this is uses. Ration, same way. Each ration is considered 1 meal. And then these just have their a durability if you need it. Same way with a torch. Whatever the GM determines that a use is. And if you're equipped, it means you're carrying it in your hand, or you have it worn on your body in some way, like your Adventurers pack would be equipped if it was worn. If you're wearing it on your back, if you were carrying your lantern in your hand, you'd equip it. And it's just to remind you that I'm now holding this thing. It doesn't have functionality as far as any of this other sheet, but it's just a reminder. And then the main part of the character tab. The first tab is the info. This is your basic character info. You can drag in when you create the character. You can drag in your heritage. Say he's a dwarf, and it'll auto-populate your heritage trait. And these are clickable links where you can gain information about this character, and also see the base attributes, which can only be changed by the GM. You can also manage your gold and gems. These are quick information links if you want to know what your dark vision does. These self-explanatory. I've added an injured or sick, because these are lasting effects that you can check to remind you that your player is affected. Currently got pulled down for the languages. I may change this to a text box so that you're not limited by the amount of languages. These are your proficiencies. In Tiny Dungeon 2nd Edition, in order to use a weapon without disadvantage, you have to be proficient in it. And if you're proficient, you can use it normally. You roll 2 dice, and then if you've mastered it, you can roll the 3 dice. So here you can select your proficiencies. If you're spell touched and you can cast magic spells, when you click this, it adds a new tab to your character sheet, and this is where your spells would be. And spells have their own activate, and it tells you their difficulty, who they can target, whether they do crits or not, whether they ignore armor or not, and then their info sheet if you want to read about them. And when you activate a spell, it rolls it. It rolled normal, and that would have been one hit with no crit. And it goes to the recycle icon just to show you that you've cast that spell. You can just click it back to normal. It's just a reminder that you've used a spell that round. And the same with if you had a user that was a martial arts user. If you got a proficiency in martial arts, you would also get a martial arts tab, which would allow you to add martial arts abilities. Same information relative to what they are, and they also have their activate, and that would have been 2 hits, whatever it did. Same thing, informational links, click them, you can read more about it. And those are some pretty cool automations that Sandbox was able to do. In the main, you've got your armor. Armor's capped at 3 now, so I'm going to change my home rule. 3 is plate, 2 is chain or full sets of hardened leather, scale mail, that kind of thing, and then 1 is basically anything else, heavy robes, soft leathers, padded armors. It says capped at 3. You can set what your armor rating is here. Your hit points. What the cap currently is, only the GM can change the cap. So if you use experience points to go up, the GM can change your max to the next number up. Your experience points here, you can just pick them off a list rather than typing them in. Your hero points, you can add and subtract. When you use a hero point, it'll show up in the chat who used a hero point. You see it'll show the name and then uses a hero point. Allows you to re-roll a dice for that round. I've got my basic test like I had before. It'll just simply roll how many dice it says. Non-critical. They're just going to one-time roll. Your initiative, which you can change it here, but when you set it here, it'll automatically, in the combat tracker, this character will automatically, if you hit, there's a button on the combat tracker that allows you to roll initiative for all characters. This is what this number uses. So the number you set here will be what automatically rolls the initiative for that character in that combat tracker. This is a hot roll. So if you put this same number here, you can then click this link and it'll also roll that initiative for that save test. We have the attacks with crits. These do the same thing that the weaponed advantage, normal, and disadvantage do. Mastered, which is 3d6 normal, 2d6 disadvantage, 1d6. And when it rolls a 6, it automatically, these tests, when a 6 is rolled, it'll automatically roll another dice and continue to explode until it doesn't. And each one of those counts as an additional hit. And those dice, with dice are nice, you adjust the look of the dice. You can have there's tons of different kinds. I put the skulls on them, I put the color to it. You can have dice that look like anything you want them to look like. It's a very, very nice module. And players' dice can be separate, different colors, different kinds than the GM's. I added this, I changed the way my critical weapons work since I changed armors. Heavy weapons now do, depending on the heavy weapon, a quarterstaff would only do 1 additional damage to unarmored opponents, but say a battle axe would do 1 additional damage to armored and unarmored. And you can remind yourself of that here. It doesn't add functionality to any rolls, but it reminds you, oh yeah, I'm doing an extra damage. Or if you had a special weapon that only did 1 extra damage to unarmed individuals, you could set that and remind you, okay, I'm supposed to do an extra damage. If you're using a heavy weapon, you click this because that's when this would come into effect, where you would do 1 extra. Certain traits also will give you, if you have the strong trait, you also do an additional damage to unarmed and armored. So if you had a heavy weapon and the strong trait, you could select this to remind you that you're supposed to be adding 2 extra damage. And that's what this is for. This is using heavy weapon as your primary. You you would type in whatever you were using here for your primary, secondary, tertiary, and your missile. Missile's also thrown. And your primary, of course, would be what you were considered using. And you could change that, but it would require an action to change this in combat. Primary, you're allowed to, if you carry your primary, say on your back or on your hip, you're allowed to draw your primary without penalty. It's a free action. And your secondary weapon can be drawn without penalty under certain circumstances. Say you fire a crossbow at the start of the round, you can then draw a primary or secondary without penalty. But after that, you start gaining I think you can draw a secondary and then attack with disadvantage under certain circumstances, and then you can draw a tertiary. You can only draw. It requires an action to pull a tertiary weapon. But that's why you list them here to remind you where they are on your person. Any other weapon that you kept fourth or fifth, you would have to use actions to get those from your pack or whatever. These are just to remind you that these weapons you keep ready at hand. That's why they're called weapons at hand. We also have your known traits, which I've got all the traits in here. I've got spells open. I mean, everything is in here. I've got the tomes, and they all have different cool icons. Got all the spells, scrolls. Traits. So you use a berserker, you put that in there, and it has an advantaged or a normal and an advantaged, depending on what the trait says, and it has its hot notes here, or you can click the link to find out more about it. Some give you advantage for certain things, and some only are normal. So I include both these in case you wanted to roll it from here instead of over here. And it says these roll crits, which means they'll explode on sixes. These won't explode on sixes. So your normal test, trait tests typically don't add crits, but if they did, I don't think these explode. Let me check. If I did, they probably did them wrong. Oh yeah, critical failure. And I can set ones. There we go. Okay, so they don't explode. I could set ones to where they do like a womp womp or a different type flash, but you roll one so often that it got annoying. And it really only matters if you roll a normal or an advantaged and you roll all ones, and you can just keep track of that yourself. There's no way to make it. Well, yes, there is. I've got a few of these set up to where if you do roll 3 ones, it'll say in the chat that you made a critical failure. But I don't. These aren't set up that way. I think the difference was Foundry didn't have that option as a roll type, but Sandbox did. So some of my weapons and things that are tied to items were capable of having that functionality, but the main rolls on the Foundry rolls weren't. So I think that's why these don't. But anyway, then you have your weapons and your items. And that's the character sheet. You can set your token up. You can set its vision rules. In a prototype, you can set who owns the token, the player, what images it uses, its size for larger creatures, whether it has vision or not. In other words, where it's limited by line of sight. This is where you'd add if it has night vision or dark vision. You would add them here. If they've if they're carrying a torch, this is also a difference in Foundry, where in Fantasy Grounds you could add an effect to the combat tracker. Foundry does it differently. If a character's playing a torch, you would right click the token and edit this to show what they were, the light range of whatever they were carrying, how far out the brightness went, how far out the dimness went, so 15 and 30, whatever. That's a different. Now you can use a module called Token Attacher to attach light sources to tokens. I haven't fooled around with that yet. It's plenty easy to do it in here if that's the only need. You can also set up what's displayed on the token. That's where you set up the hit bar. It's displayed on the token, and when it's displayed, never when controlled, when hovered over by anyone. He's hovered over by anyone, and then always the player characters. That's what I had him set. It's always for everyone.
The GM has divided this video into 3 sections for length. Please watch part 3 for the last part and wrap up.